Hey friends, Mars here. Welcome to this special edition of the heyBrownBerry podcast. This is going to be a series of videos that I put together to do a review. Now, this is my first really extensive yarn review of any kind. I actually was contacted by a company called Hobbii, and I thought it would be interesting to do this yarn review as a series of videos, starting from telling you a bit about what I've learned about the company that sent me this yarn, and then working my way through a project. So the clips that you'll see in this video will all have been filmed at different times, and my intent is to walk you through the process of using this yarn in a project and really giving you my honest feedback on it. So if it's something that you're interested in, at least you'll have one knitting friend's perspective on what it was like to work with it. So I hope you enjoy this series, and as always, on this episode, I'll welcome your feedback, whether you have experience with this yarn or not. I'm going to start right from the beginning. I was contacted by the company to review this yarn, and they were very respectful in giving me options as to whether or not I wanted to do the review, what type of yarn or other supplies from their online shop I would like to review, and it gave me some time to think about what I would use and what I wanted to get out of doing a yarn review. So in short, my goal was, if this was a company that I would recommend to others, why would I want to tell them about this particular yarn shop? And what I came to was that it would be great to find a supplier of what I consider to be affordable yarns, especially for people who are looking to buy, say, a sweater's quantity, which could be a varying amount, but for most people a sweater's quantity is several balls or skeins. And then it would also be a great opportunity for me to get to understand a company sort of behind the scenes. As many of you know, I'm very interested in making connections in our community, so I thought of this as an opportunity to do that, to connect people who watch this channel to a yarn company that I've done a bit of research to find out more about them and their business practices and sort of their philosophy. And I've been able to do that to a good extent, an extent that I'm satisfied with. So just know that as I'm doing this review, there are some other things that I will indicate to you in the series that I hope are important to you as well. So let's get to the yarn. And I'm just going to give you a close-up view of what I chose. Since today's the day I decided I would start swatching, you can see my needle cases here. I've got a series of interchangeable needles as well as some double-pointed needles that I store in these cases, and I thought, why not take you through the whole process? So here's the yarn that I chose. As I'm filming, the color of this yarn may shift a bit, and that tends to happen with blues and greens and combinations in that range. What you're seeing now is a bit more blue than the color in real life, but it's a very close representation. If I move it here to some natural lighting, at the risk of having it blown out, that's a very blue version of this yarn. It's actually got a bit more green in it. This yarn is from the Hobbii Nature line, and I chose it specifically because it's a 100% organic wool. And when I think about affordable yarns, I don't always think about an organic option because organic materials do tend to cost more. On the whole, that applies across different things, not just yarn. But I thought if I were to recommend an organic yarn source, it would be great to get one that was somewhat affordable. And I'll talk about the cost and other things throughout the video, but just wanted you to get an idea of the skeins themselves. This is the Nature brand, 100% organic wool. On the label, there's some information from Hobbii. It's 50 grams per ball, about 230 meters, which translates to close to 250 yards. The needle size they recommend is a 3. And then they give a gauge of 28 stitches and 39 rows in a 10 by 10 centimeter or 4-inch square. So that's about 7 stitches and just over 9, almost 10 rows per inch. that mental math. As you see on the label, the yarn is designed in Scandinavia and made with love in Asia. And then they give some care instructions. So just right off the bat, the feel of the yarn in the skein is soft with a very, very slight toothiness. I wouldn't even describe this with the typical rustic. It's definitely not on the rustic scale, just by feel in the ball. It's much smoother. You can see it's a 2-ply. Actually, just double checking that. Yeah, it's a 2-ply, fairly tightly spun. I'll probably get a better sense of that once I actually knit with it. I chose this color because I like how it looks against my skin tone, and I intend to make a sweater out of it. So it was nice to get enough in one dye lot to make a garment. I've got 10 balls total, so that's well over 2,000 yards. I expect that will give me a good range of sweaters I can work with. And based on my swatch, I have a sweater in mind that I'm going to share with you. So once I'm done swatching, I will give you an update on where I end up with gauge, etc., and that will determine whether or not it's going to work for the sweater I'm thinking about. Choosing my needles now, and based on the information on the ball band, I know that this is a fingering weight gauge. The needle size they recommend is a 3, and because this is a European company, I'm going to assume that that means 3 millimeters, which would be a US size 2. It certainly would match this small, finer gauge. So I'm looking through my needles to see what I want to use to swatch. I try to swatch with what I believe I'm going to knit with, from a size perspective, obviously, but also from a materials perspective. I do have several different types of needles in different sizes. The 3 millimeter needle, or US 2, that I picked up so far is my set of Addi Turbos, my Sock Rocket metal needles. These are a 47 inch or 120 centimeter needle, and that would be good for knitting most things in the round, especially if I'm doing magic loop. The sweater I'm considering is a top-down colorwork yoke sweater, so it's possible that I may need a different cable length at the top of the sweater. 47 inches or 120 centimeters might be a bit long for starting a neckline. So I'll have to work through that, but I am going to start my swatch on these needles. Now, reading the label and seeing that it's a needle size 3, I almost thought immediately of a US 3, which would be actually 3.25 millimeters, which is a little larger. These are my Knit Picks fixed circulars, also metal. It's possible that I may knit the yarn on the Addis and decide that I want to go up. So just having different needle sizes available when I swatch lets me move from one to the other once I get to see the fabric they each create. I'm using a standard long tail cast on for my swatch because I'm not too concerned about it being stretchy in this case. I'm just working to get enough stitches on the needles that I can eventually do some decent measurements. When I'm swatching, I really am trying to figure out a bit more than just the gauge. It's a process of getting to know the yarn. For a sweater project where I'll be knitting thousands of stitches, I really want to feel confident from the beginning that it's a yarn I want to work with, that the yarn and needle combination is going to be good for long sessions of knitting. And there are a few other things For example, what yarn looks like in a skein or in a bowl or even when it's caked up in terms of the color and the tone is one thing. And I find that sometimes it's very different once you have that yarn knit up into stitches. Even the color and shades can shift a bit when you're looking at it as stitches knit up next to each other. The feel of a yarn and how it slides across a needle, I mean, there's really no way to figure that out other than just to knit with it. So when I do decide to do a swatch, which is not always, I'm not a purist, but when I do decide to swatch, that's part of what motivates me, is getting an understanding of the yarn. Do I even like working with it? Do I have the right needle combination? Working with wool, which I tend to do now more often. Sometimes a metal needle that's slick is just the right type for the yarn, and other times it works better to have a bit more grab by using something like a wooden needle or something in between, like a carbons needle that has a bit of grip but still has very smooth tips. So I'm working right now with these Addi Turbos, which are metal. They are somewhat pointy. The tips are the kind that would be good for lace or a lot of stitch movement, like increases and decreases. They're quite smooth, not to the point of too slick. The yarn's moving across them quite well. But another consideration is the ply. The ply on this yarn is fairly loose, which means some needles might get in between those plies, and if the yarn is quite splitty, then pointy, slick tips is not going to make for a very comfortable knit. I like what I feel so far with this combination of metal needles and this yarn. I'm flicking the yarn with my right hand. I've actually practiced over a period of time to knit both continental and English style. So I can tension the yarn in my left hand and do what's commonly called picking for continental, and I can also tension the yarn like I'm doing now in my right hand and do what's called flicking, where I flick the working yarn over the tip of the needle in order to form the new stitch. I like the gauge that I get when I flick and tension with my right hand. I typically get a gauge and a fabric that's close to what's recommended in a pattern or even recommended on the ball band of the yarn. My gauge with continental is looser, and so often with that looser gauge I need to go down a needle size in order to achieve the measurements I'm after. I really go back and forth now between both knitting styles. I use all different kinds of knitting methods. I knit magic loop, I knit with 2 circulars, I knit on DPNs. I tend to just try to work with the best method and the best needle for the project, and that's come with time and experience. I'm not in a huge rush to just dive in when it's a bigger project, so I'll take the time to figure out how I want to knit. Now this swatch is being done on needles with a lot of cable. I may or may not stick with these when I get into the sweater knit. At 47 inches on the cable, I could do magic loop knitting for a smaller circumference like the neckline and be fine, but I wouldn't necessarily use this cable length in the body of the sweater. I would most likely use a cable length that's much smaller to knit in the round. What are the kinds of things that you pay attention to when you're swatching? Do you swatch? Are there certain projects you'll swatch for and not others? For example, I tend not to swatch for shawl projects. I feel like there's enough flexibility in a shawl that I could make it bigger or smaller just by changing the yarn and needle size. Share with me your philosophy on swatching, what you like and don't like, what you're looking for out of a swatch. I do intend to wash and block this swatch when I'm done. Got a nice garter stitch border going. I cast on 40 stitches. I want to have more on the needle than a 4-inch space so that I can easily measure my gauge over at least 2 or 3 inches so that I get a representation of stitches and rows. Hello again. Swatching continues. I thought I would just give you guys a look at where I am in my swatch process so far and talk to you a little bit about how I mimic a gauge that's closer to my in the round gauge, because I'll be knitting most of this sweater in the round. So I'm going to show you a technique that I use to do that without actually creating a tube or a circular swatch. So I'm using a cushion here that's going to help me give you a closer view of the swatch and also keep these metal needle ends from tapping all over the table, because I don't want that to disrupt the sound or be hard on your ears. So the way I've decided to do my swatch is I want it to be large enough that I could measure at least 2 to 3 inches for my stitch gauge going across, and at least a couple of inches for my row gauge going vertically. And I almost always start my swatch with some garter stitch, especially if I know that I'm swatching for stockinette stitching, as I am here, because this little patch of garter stitch helps to keep the swatch somewhat flat, and it makes it so that the area I have to measure on the stockinette is larger. If I didn't do that, stockinette rolls, as you know, if it doesn't have any kind of border or edge. And the first thing I want to say is that the yarn knits up a bit more toothy than it feels in the ball, so it is still fairly soft. This is not baby soft, but that's not what I expected for 100% wool. But it does have more structure than I expected, and even though it's loosely plied, I really like how the stitches are coming together. Let me give you a closer look. I'm doing this as a reminder on a US 3, which is a 3.25 millimeter needle, and you can see that there's not much spacing in between the stitches. You can't see my fingers very well behind it, but it's also not so dense as to be stiff. It still has some movement in the fabric, so I like that. So what I've been doing is, in order to get closer to my in the round gauge, which is what happens when you're knitting stockinette in the round, is essentially you're just knitting all the stitches. There's no purling to balance out the way the stitches lie. So I use this smaller circular needle. I've actually switched from the one I had before because the cable was too long, and that allows me to move this swatch from one end of the needle to the other very easily. The reason I want to be able to do that is, in order to knit this swatch, I am knitting across the row, and then I'm pulling my working yarn strand behind the swatch, and when I finish, I'm at one end of the needle. So instead of turning it around to purl, I just move the swatch to the other end of the needle, and that working yarn goes across the back, and I kind of hold it loosely back there, and I begin knitting with it again. Now if I turn this over, you're going to see that in order to create this swatch, I've already done that several times, and that's why you have a group of strands back here that are going across the back of my swatch. And what that does is it allows me to just start knitting again across the row from this end going over. So I'm going to just do a video of myself completing a row and starting another so you can see what I'm talking about. So I've reached the end of this particular row. Here's my working yarn at the back, as you'd expect. I'm on this end of the needle. And in order to start the next row by knitting again, I just slide the whole swatch to the other end of the needle. See, my working yarn is tailing off back here. And before I begin, I just bring that working yarn back towards the ready to knit position. And what helps me to keep the strands in the back fairly loose so that the whole swatch doesn't pull in too much and make it hard to measure is that I'll just put a couple of my fingers on my left hand behind that strand before I get ready to knit with it. So that way I know that there's some looseness back there. There's some looseness in the strand before I begin knitting with it, and it's not going to just pull the whole thing in. And then I would insert my needle as normal. Sometimes I might even just put a little extra loop in to start that first stitch. Again, just so that I have some looseness back there. Not too much, but enough that it's not going to pull in. And I just knit my first stitch, and then I'm fine. I can leave that extra loop back there and continue across the row again. The purpose is to knit all rows because that mimics what you'll be doing when you're knitting stockinette in the round, and that's the gauge that I'm looking for in this swatch for now. When it was dry, I measured my swatch at 6.5 stitches per inch and 10.5 rows. Back again, lovelies. Today is swatch layout day. I actually finished and bound off my swatch, and I've decided I'm going to just check the measurements. I want to see the difference before and after soaking it. I did a full wet block on it with a little Eucalan, which is a rinse-free wool wash. And my gauge, I'll show you what I've got so far. Forgive the lawnmower noise in the background, but here is my swatch. It's actually quite damp. The gauge before I soaked it was 6.5 stitches and 10.5 rows. So it's a pretty fine gauge. If I put this a little closer, you can see pretty small stitches on that US 3 or 3.25 millimeter needle. This is now wet, and what I want to do is just pin it out here to dry. I don't want to stretch it too much. I kind of want to see what will happen naturally with the swatch without too much manipulation. Now, if I was going for a particular gauge, I might use a measured blocking board so I could set it up to a specific measurement. I'm not going to do that here. And when it's dry, I'm going to use this Ann Budd Knits gauge ruler, which has really cool little markings so that I can line it up with the stitches and see exactly how many stitches per inch I get once it's dry. And then I can use this edge to determine how many rows per inch. So I'm just going to let that dry. Might come back to it tomorrow. As I mentioned earlier in this first part of the series, I wanted to get to know a bit more about this company, Hobbii. They're based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I thought it would be good for me to get to know them from, asking questions and getting answers in their own words. So before I give you the swatch outcome, I thought I would share with you some of the answers that they sent to me based on a couple of questions I sent. So you'll forgive me if I look down a little bit because I have to read from my screen. They gave some really good answers and I want to share them completely. So one of the first questions I asked was, does Hobbii have a publicly available statement that addresses their position about diversity and inclusion, either for their employees or through their website for website visitors? And do they have that same kind of statement for companies that they support through projects and through collaborations or even in manufacturing? And here's their answer. No, we do not have a publicly available statement. Hobbii does favor a workforce that is diverse in terms of gender, age, race, sexuality, and nationality, which we've successfully achieved in our 4 years of existence. As a global company, we also aim to show sensitivity to individual cultures by employing natives of each of the countries where we have designated web shops. And because Hobbii is such a diverse work environment, it is the priority of Gunhild Jaker, our HR manager, please forgive any mispronunciation, to make sure people in the company feel seen, included, and valued as individuals every day. We do not post statistics about our staff on our website because it is not as relevant in Danish culture as it could be in the US, and it is not our wish to tokenize employees. However, we are sensitive to and aware of the conversation about the lack of inclusivity in the creative community. As individuals, we address this issue by keeping on empowering the less visible. For example, we actively reach out to women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, men, all in hopes to collaborate, and also send regular yarn donations to charities and to communities where they are more represented. We are very much aware that we are just getting started and that we have much to learn, but it is something that the members of our little team, who also find ourselves to be members of the aforementioned groups, discuss on a daily basis. I really appreciate Hobbii taking the time to answer this question. It's obviously a potentially sensitive question, and it's very difficult to judge a business just based on the products you see on a website. So I'm really grateful they were able to and willing to answer that question for me. Please feel free to comment if you have anything to say about your experience with this company. I was satisfied with the fact that they gave the answer they gave and that it came across to me as very genuine. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little extra tidbit of information. Let's take a look at my dried swatch. Well, my swatch has been washed, as I said, and then I put it to dry, so it's completely dry now. The first thing I noticed is that the yarn has definitely softened, and I can even feel in the stitches a little bit of bloom, meaning it just feels like the stitches have expanded a little and they feel softer for sure. So I'm going to measure and see if that holds true. So on this ruler, as I said, there are some notches that indicate stitches per inch. You line up these notches with the stitches in your swatch. You can see them here, and based on their spacing, it tells you how many stitches per inch. So I'm going to check that out. It's a bit of trial and error. You kind of try one measurement, like 5.5 stitches per inch, and if they don't quite line up, you may go up or down. I'm going to go up to 6 stitches per inch, which seems to line up a bit closer. What about 7 stitches per inch? Closer still. And I'm looking at all of the rows in here to see if I can really determine what's the closest. So, sorry, right now I'm at 6.5 stitches per inch. If I go up to 7 is off. So back to 6 just to kind of double check. And I like to check different areas of the swatch too. Okay. So if I line this up with a series of stitches in different places on my swatch, because you know our tension can change over the course of knitting, even such a small piece as a swatch. I'm feeling pretty confident that 6.5 stitches per inch is about where we are. Now that matches my gauge before washing and blocking, and I didn't do any stretching, so it's not surprising. If the yarn really were going to bloom a lot, I might notice a significant difference If I go down to 6 stitches per inch, for example, it doesn't quite match up. So that seems to be the same. Then using my ruler measurements along the edge, I just pick a marker on the ruler. So for example, this 4-inch marker here, and I put it near the top of one of the stitches, and I'm going to count down to the 5-inch mark. So this is 1 inch worth of knit rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this time, and I'm going to measure another one, just always good to check a different area. 10. So interestingly, the original stitch gauge was about 10.5 rows per inch. And now I'm measuring in a couple different areas, and it's right spot on at 10 rows per inch. So there's been a bit of vertical shrinkage there. And that's important for me to know, because when I knit my sweater, if the schematic or the pattern directions call for a certain length, I'm going to want to account for the fact that my yarn, when washed, will kind of pull in a little bit. It hasn't translated to a very big difference horizontally, but vertically I'm going to want to keep in mind the lengths that I'm trying to achieve. And those are adjustments that are typically easy to make in a pattern. The one that I'm doing is top down, and I'm going to show it to you now. I've decided to knit the Gardengate sweater by Jennifer Steingass. The yarn that you saw in that short video clip is my color choice for this top-down colorwork yoke sweater. I'm going to combine this Hobbii wool with a new to me yarn, which is from Lanivendole. It's an Italian yarn company, and I discovered them at the Woolen Yarn Festival a couple of weeks ago, and the two ladies who run it are phenomenal, and they were such a treat. I interviewed them in one of my woolen blogs and fell in love with their yarns right from the beginning. In looking at these two yarns, they have about a similar put up in 50 grams, and they're both 2-ply. They feel like they're going to do very well for color work. I like yarns for color work that are a bit grabby. Can be very forgiving when you're working those color work rows if the yarns want to hang on to each other and cover up or fill in some of the spaces. So here's a look at the sweater that I've chosen, the Gardengate pullover by Jennifer Steingass. I chose this sweater for multiple reasons. I'm a fan of Jennifer's designs, and I've already knit one of her sweaters, the Fern and Feather, and it was a very successful knit. I was very happy with how it turned out. I thought the pattern writing was really clear and the design was gorgeous. But I felted that sweater, unintentionally felted it in a wash cycle, and I am really looking forward to replacing this type of pullover in my wardrobe. So that's it for part 1 of the series. Part 2 will cover more of my project knit on the Gardengate sweater. I'm really happy with this Hobbii yarn so far. I've decided what I'll do is I'll put some information about the yarn itself, the cost, and some links to the website in the description box below. So far so good. I'll see how it knits up in the course of a larger project and share that with you. Thanks as always for being here, guys. I hope you're having a good week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye. Mwah.